Hi, you're watching Investor Insights, and in this video I'd like to talk about America's $17 trillion debt problem. Well, first things first, the word problem is an understatement. Crisis would still be an understatement. I really have to think about what hyperbole or superlative I have to use to describe this problem, but for now we'll just call it a problem. I'm gonna start this discussion off by talking about the origins of this $17 trillion. And going back a couple of hundred years after America declared independence, it managed to borrow a lot of money from the Europeans. But this debt, over the subsequent 100 odd years, or almost 200 years, was used to fund productive things. It used the money to build bridges, roads, infrastructure. It used the money to build factories, and the factories in turn produced goods, consumer goods, which it's then sold to the rest of the world. Things were looking really good for America, and this went on until about the mid-1980s, where at that stage America was the largest creditor nation in the world as a result of being the most productive nation in the world. America loaned more money to every other nation, to every other debtor nation in the world, more than every other creditor nation put together. And America owned more foreign assets than everybody else put together. Now, if you fast forward to today, modern America, the financial landscape of the American economy, in comparison to that of the 1980s, looks as if a nuclear bomb has hit it, and it has never recovered. What America looks like now is one that's laden with debt, a totally unproductive economy, and to make it even worse, the only way that it's perceived to grow is through the government's encouragement of its people's debt finance consumption. In the space of 30 years, America has turned from the wealthiest of creditor nations to now basically being the poorest debtor nation. And without making things too complicated, the numbers that are involved in this discussion are huge. 17 trillion is a huge number, regardless of which direction you look at it from, or against what you measure it against. Because the number is so big that even in astronomy, a light year is the distance that light travels in 1 year, of which light travels 300,000 kilometers per second. And 1 light year is 10 trillion kilometers. And that's a big distance. And America's deficit is even bigger than a light year. This is a huge number. But anyway, let's talk about why is it such a problem. Well, the biggest issue with the debt is that it's so big. And how it got so big is that the government, or actually the actual American economy, has never ever decided to look back upon its foundation of being a high productive capacity nation, producing goods and services that it can sell to the rest of the world, or even just barter it against other countries' exports. I mean, the whole point of paying for imports is with exports. And if you don't manufacture anything, then all you're paying for your imports are basically IOUs. And this is where America's debts have come from. The fact that it stopped producing, or it lost its competitive advantage over the Asians or whoever else is out there manufacturing at this point in time, and it decided to go in the biggest spending binge the world has ever seen. And this binge wasn't, as I said, to buy productive assets or any assets of any value. The debt was used to buy depreciating consumer goods. Things like TVs, cameras, cars, going on holidays, very wasteful enterprises. And if you know anything about economics or even just sound business policy, if you take on debt and you don't make efforts to pay back that debt's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger until the bank comes knocking and basically takes everything away from you. That's if you're lucky. If you used a loan shark, you're going to be missing limbs. So America has decided to take on all this debt and fund its unquenchable thirst to spend. Now, spending begets more spending, so debt begets more debt. Now, let's go back to the first issue that I was raising, was the size of this debt. Now, 17 trillion, right now, the interest bill last year for all that debt was about $250 billion. And that's just based on 0% interest rates. The US government can't afford rates to go any higher. And if it did, it would basically default. Because it doesn't have the room within its budget to pay much higher rates of interest on all that debt. So I've attached a link to this video in the information box that talks about the Treasury Secretary discussing the fact that America is going to run out of money by about mid-October if it doesn't raise its debt ceiling. And this is something which has been going on and on and on and on in the past, but it's going to happen more and more frequently because the debt is getting bigger. And all these little increases in the debt ceiling aren't going to be of any significance. So if push comes to shove, this could become a fortnightly event in due time. They should just make it an infinite debt ceiling, because that's what they really want, and basically print money and inflate themselves to oblivion. But that's a different discussion. So the debt is too big, and the interest, even right now, the 10-year is almost not touching 3%. So this has climbed almost 50% in the past 4 months, from below 2 to almost 3%. With debt that's so large, and with interest rates so low, it's quite feasible for the government to just keep on issuing more debt, even just to fund the interest on this current debt, but also to fund this American appetite for consumption. But there comes a time when the creditors are just going to say, well, enough is enough. We actually want something in return. One of the questions that I'm very often asked is, why do people lend them the money? Why do the Chinese actually purchase these American treasuries? Or why do the Japanese do it? Or why do the Arabs do it? Well, the simple answer is they don't. They don't have any choice. They send goods over to the States, and the States doesn't have anything to pay them back with, either through precious metals or exports, whatever. So they just perpetuate a lie where they just print IOUs and send them over to these sucker creditor nations in exchange for all these goods and services. And when the interest accrues and it's due to be paid, or the debt matures and is due to be rolled over, all the Americans do is print more debt and send them over to replace the old debt and to pay off the interest. By which I don't really mean pay off, because nothing is really ever paid off. So you've got China holding almost $2 trillion worth, Japan's holding over $1 trillion worth, God knows how much the Arabs are holding. But these numbers are getting bigger and bigger. And these these creditor nations are happy to be exporting these goods and services in return for nothing, technically in return for jobs for their citizens, but no money. There will come a time when these guys are just going to snap, as I said before. But let's take a look at the complex issue of this actual debt. Now, $17 trillion is not just something that has to be rolled over every year or every 5 or 10 years. It's made up of short-dated, medium-dated, and long-dated treasuries. Now, for some reason, the Fed decided through Operation Twist, or there was 2 Operation Twists, to sell off their short-dated debt and buy long-dated debt instead. They did that twice over the past couple of years. Why? I don't know. I just can't answer that. I think it's just to put off the inevitable. Maybe because they think that they can hold this implosion for another 20 or 30 years. Well, regardless of what happens, when they have to tighten, these long-dated, they can't wait 20 or 30 years to tighten, because the country would have imploded long before then. And with all the short-dated maturities, I know about a quarter of all that debt has to be renewed inside the next year or two. So the problem is that if you have a quarter of 17 trillion, which is about $4 trillion, the government doesn't have that money to pay off all this maturing debt. All it can do is just print more debt and hope that the sucker creditors are willing to exchange what they're holding, which is maturing, to this stuff which is maturing a lot later. It's just a giant Ponzi scheme. And as I said before, someone's going to give up the ghost and just walk away, because right now they're just throwing more good money after bad. So the debt issue is such that it's not one that's going to just disappear. It's only going to get bigger and bigger. And just yesterday, I was reading this article on Bloomberg.com talking about how America has recovered from the Great Recession, how everything's all rosy now. Consumers are spending more than ever. That's a very, very scary phrase I was looking for. Consumers are borrowing more than ever, consumers are spending more than ever, and the economy is getting stronger and stronger as a consequence of that. Well, I've put that article, the link to this article, in the description box, and you can have a laugh in your own time. But let's just say that again, using debt finance consumption as 70% of your gross domestic product means that your whole economy is phony. Your whole economy is based on consuming other suckers' goods and hope that they're just too stupid to figure your scam out. Well, let's see how long that lasts. But let's take a look at why the economy is so flawed and why debt becomes such a destructive force in that economy. I want you to take a look at two very simple cases. We're just going to look at two human beings. We're just going to call one of them Joe and the other guy's Chin. Joe Joe and Chin are on the same salary. Joe goes out and spends and spends and spends. Whatever he earns, he just goes out and just spends it. He doesn't save for a rainy day. He doesn't save for his kids' education. He just doesn't want to stop his consumption. He wants to live the life. Now, Chin, on the other hand, works hard and he sacrifices his present consumption by saving and by using his savings to invest, and hopefully in due time, through the power of compound interest, his ability to consume will be greatly enhanced in the future. Chin doesn't go on vacations, he eats at home, he does all the right things because he just feels that he doesn't want to worry about the future by spending everything that he earns today. Now, on the surface, these two people, you can treat them as economies. And on the surface, you look at Joe's economy, there's a lot of consumption, and it looks great compared to Chin, because Chin, it's all savings and underconsumption. So Chin's economy looks much worse than Joe's economy. And an economist, who are all idiots anyway, an economist will look at these two economies and just say, well, Joe has the better economy. But most people don't think or look beneath the surface, because what Joe's doing is to the detriment of his future, because he's got no savings. And Chin, although he's under consuming now, he's going to have a much better future than Joe. And to make this matter even worse, I'm going to say that Joe, not only does he spend everything he earns, but he borrows heavily. And he spends what he borrows, again, on more useless crap, like holidays, cars, just depreciating assets. And Chin chooses not to borrow. Now, Chin could be the Chinese economy. It could be any economy out there that's a productive economy and one of savings. Joe, on the other hand, is the American economy. And by borrowing and borrowing and borrowing more and more and more, because interest rates are so low, Joe feels that he's living the high life. And the more he borrows, the more he consumes, the more people look at him and say, wow, look at this bloke, it's amazing, I want to be just like him. And the scary thing is, that's what the whole world is trying to model their economies on, is just like the US. They want to have a consumption economy. So this whole concept of service sector economies is flawed, because in life, somebody's got to work hard, produce and save. And yes, certain people can consume and spend. And economies are a balance of the two. When you've got such a huge imbalance as to have your whole economy, or basically 2/3 of your economy based around consumption, you know that this imbalance, this structural imbalance, is going to cause a lot of problems, especially when that consumption is funded through debt. Albeit the debt being cheap right now, it's going to get much, much higher. And when the interest on the debt becomes unbearable, Joe's stuck in a rut. He's like, how can I borrow more? Are the banks going to lend me more, or do I have to default? And this is where America is right now. It's looking not quite at the barrel of a shotgun that says you're gone, but it's not that far away. And all this stuff that the Fed's been doing, printing more money, and the government issuing more bonds, and the Fed price fixing interest rates by purchasing bonds, is a game that's going to end in tears. Because on the surface, it all looks all rosy, just like the article in which I've put in the link through which I've put in the description box. Americans are now spending more than ever, and they feel wealthier than ever. Well, they only feel wealthier than ever because they've borrowed more than ever. And this is a very dangerous spiral. This debt spiral never ends. And when you don't make an effort to pay back debt, as I've said before, it just gets bigger and bigger. And just because you've got low interest rates doesn't mean that this problem is just going to go away. As I've said in previous videos, if you don't believe that debt will never go away, go and borrow a crapload of money from a loan shark and see how long it takes this guy to forget your debt. And believe me, you're going to be missing many limbs before this guy forgets what you owe him. So let's just say debt never goes away. So you've got the Fed artificially keeping rates low when rates should be much higher, because, as you know, interest rates are a function of the supply and demand of money. When money is rather scarce and people want to borrow it in great number, then the rates have to be high. Rates can't be low when everybody's wanting to borrow money, because then the supply of money is going to become too big. You want to discourage borrowing. The Fed's doing the total opposite. It wants people to borrow a lot more than they should, and spend that money to stimulate GDP, or so-called fudged up GDP, and it comes to basically one ultimate price, and that price is inflation. And to those who don't have a grasp of what inflation is, and they just think that it's just a gradual rise in prices of goods and services, it's technically not that. The old definition of inflation is an increase in the money supply. So for money to be of value, it must be scarce. But at the same time, one of money's attributes must be that it holds its value over time. Now, to hold its value over time, money has to be in a defined supply. And when you pump money, and keep in mind that money is just pieces of paper, when you print more pieces of paper into a system, and there's the same number of goods and services within the system, but a lot more pieces of paper, and so technically you've got a lot more pieces of paper chasing the same number of goods and services, of course those things are going to go up in price. Now pretend I'm not just going to print a little bit of paper, I'm just going to flood the system with huge amounts of paper. Well, technically that paper shouldn't be called money anymore, simply because money is not holding its value. When you've got a huge amount of extra paper pumped into the system, it devalues all the previous amounts of paper that's in there and makes it worthless. And I always say scarcity should bring value. Now, you can't print gold, so gold will always have its purchasing power, regardless of what inflation is. Money won't. And if you don't believe that something like this could happen, look at Zimbabwe. In their case, it was spectacular. It happened over, 3, 4, 5 years. A few years ago, they had an inflation rate of 4,000,000% a year. And it's not just paper. You have to remember that a treasury or a piece of government debt is an IOU. And that IOU is in US dollars. So if you print a lot of IOUs, it's just like printing money. And the more bonds you print, the less all the other bonds are worth, because it's just like money. So this problem with America of having all these extra debt issued in the first place will lead to a total devaluing of the country's currency. So it will just become a currency crisis in the long term. when this thing implodes, the American dollar is going to basically disappear overnight. And the government can do what the Vietnam government did during the Vietnam War and just change its currency overnight. And so the American dollar could disappear and they could be replaced with the American ping pong for all I know. And all that debt, all these IOUs, their value will be meaningless. And basically all those pieces of, all that American debt will basically be worth something like this. And to be quite frank, this will be more valuable than American treasuries, because American treasuries are too rough to wipe your ass with. It sounds very cynical, and it sounds like a whole lot of propaganda, but it isn't, because everything that I've just told you is based on facts. It's the government and the Fed that's issuing all the propaganda by saying that everything is good, everything is sound, you should go out and consume, you should go out and borrow to consume, and thus we will look after you. We will keep on keeping rates, we will keep on fixing rates low. Well, as you can see, if you constantly have debt ceiling debates going on and possible talk of defaults, this problem is never going to go away. And you can remove the debt ceiling altogether, and the creditors eventually will say enough is enough. We want money. In fact, we don't want any of your paper. We want gold, we want precious metals, and we're not going to send you any more stuff anymore. You can make your own stuff. Our population can produce their own stuff and consume their own goods. Why should we produce everything for you and not have anything in return for all our hard work? It's not a good deal. I'm sure most people out there won't accept this deal. So all this debt is going to come crumbling down, and America just has to default. And default is going to come in one of two ways. It can just default, like Argentina has, or Russia has, the Asian nations did back in 1997. They just say, right, we just can't pay him. Sorry, you just have to forgive our debt. And basically you go through a very painful 5, maybe 10, 15, 20 years of nobody sending you anything, and you've got to live in poverty for a long time, and you're going to have to rebuild your reputation as a creditworthy nation. Or the other alternative is what's looking more and more likely by the minute, especially now that WTI has just crossed 112. Let's just say that the Fed is going to create an inflationary default. And the inflationary default simply means that it's going to print and print and print and print and print to infinity. And it's going to flood the system with so much pieces of that actual toilet paper becomes more valuable than that paper. And therefore, the Chinese will be holding on to this. And the Chinese people can basically wipe their butts with it because it has no value. In fact, their paper won't even be able to buy toilet paper. Toilet paper will be far more expensive than American treasuries. So America will be able to pay back its debt, easily pay back its debt. I mean, Zimbabwe currently has $100 trillion notes in circulation, but their $100 trillion notes can't even buy you a loaf of bread. So the Fed can keep on printing money until the debt becomes meaningless, and thus America can just easily send them one piece of paper on it that says $17 trillion and repay all its debt. But unfortunately, the sucker that receives that piece of paper will be left scratching his or her head saying, how did it get to this and why did we let it get to this? That's a discussion for another day. But let's just say all the happy talk, all the happy discussion, all the markets gains and all the bond markets gains are all illusions. If you believe the propaganda that the government or the Fed is telling you about the state of the economy being in a sound position, all that is a lie. And believing it is going to cost you a lot of money. So in due time, you have to learn to protect yourself. You've got to invest in assets that's not going to be totally deflated in value by the Fed or other central banks out there, and possibly invest in instruments that's going to protect you from the coming implosion. In fact, you can make a lot of money from the implosion. And that will be the subject for another video. But for now, you have got to believe, or you have got to treat all this American debt as this.